The King's approval rating has held up despite these very personal criticisms that have been made about him by his own son. So in that regard, from a PR perspective, you could say the House of Windsor's pulled off a bit of a miracle. I think you look back on the last 12 months and you think that Charles has put in a pretty solid performance, from the way he reacted to the public outpouring of grief following the death of his mother, to executing a pretty faultless tour of Germany, to being at the major and key moments, and actually the coronation went off pretty much without a hitch. Yes, there was that delay as he arrived a bit too early at Westminster Abbey, and he looked to be a little bit angry about that. But apart from that, I think it's been pretty seamless, the transition. You'd have thought that there'd be a bigger aftershock after the loss of a woman who'd been such an important and integral part of the fabric of British life for more than 70 years. But what's been interesting about the transition is the idea of the crown enduring, and perhaps the fact that the public have grown so used to the notion of Prince Charles one day becoming king that when the moment happened and when the accession happened and the subsequent coronation, it didn't come as that much of a shock to the nation to see both Charles and Camilla on the Buckingham Palace balcony in their crowns. Having said that, perhaps the image of Queen Camilla at the coronation was quite jarring for some people. Up until very recently, the suggestion had been that she wouldn't be known as the Queen, but the Queen Consort, because people felt that because of the controversial nature of their relationship, the idea that Charles had an affair with Camilla behind Princess Diana's back, that just as she would never be accepted as Princess of Wales and never used that title and instead was known as the Duchess of Cornwall, that equally she'd be never accepted as the Queen, following on from Elizabeth II. Camilla's almost made herself more difficult to accept by the public because she's dropped the consort part of her title. And if that rankles with some people, it's because she's insisted that she be called the Queen as opposed to Queen Consort, which almost kind of reminds people of the shoes that she personally is having to fill in carrying on that title. There is this degree to which I think perhaps the monarchy has become a bit more transparent since Charles III took over, because they're letting the cameras in at all these intimate moments, and that can prove to be at times difficult. For instance, when he was being filmed in the Accession Council, I don't think you'd have had cameras that close in the latter stages of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, but he let the cameras in, and then Fountain Pen Gate happens and it all gets recorded on camera, and then obviously in the social media era these moments can go viral and pose problems. So that's a balancing act for the king. Decisions that have subsequently been made perhaps would never have been made under the late Queen's watch are perhaps the idea of the Commonwealth Games now being in jeopardy. The state of Victoria in Australia was going to host the next Games. They've said they haven't got enough money, they've pulled the plug. And you have to ask yourself whether Victoria would have pulled the plug if Queen Elizabeth II was still on the throne. Do they feel they've got more leeway now that it's King Charles? Is King Charles as popular in the Commonwealth as his late mother, who famously was the most travelled monarch in history and made huge efforts to go and meet her peoples in all of these different countries around the world to make sure that there was always a strong connection between the Commonwealth and the Crown back in England. So I think perhaps that's a key concern. Again, that puts the pressure not only on the King and Queen to kind of extend their remit beyond the UK and go and visit some of these Commonwealth countries, it's also beholden on William and Kate to follow suit. And that indeed, in turn, poses a few problems for them domestically, because they're trying to be hands-on parents to their children. They want to be present for them. They don't want to be away from the UK for weeks on end. So that's a careful balancing act. I suppose the PR advisors will be saying, well, choose to go away in the school holidays and take the children with you, because the likes of George, Charlotte and Louis seem to prove a big draw at major royal events, and I'm sure there are people in Commonwealth countries that would be delighted to see them in the flesh. There had been some suggestions that the king is in a hurry, but in my experience, royals are never in a hurry. This is part of the reason why Harry and Meghan got so frustrated with their nearest and dearest, because they wanted everything to happen overnight. And from a royal perspective, it's always a marathon, not a sprint. Charles has waited his entire life to be king, and I think he wants to make sure that he can do it properly and that it can be as seamless as possible, which is You know, not an insignificant feat really when you consider just how revered his late mother was when she was on the throne for 70 years. After this first year of quite a lot of recrimination, it's easy to forget just how damaging the Netflix documentary was, just how damaging Spare was, which was highly critical, let's not forget, of Queen Camilla, talking her about leaving bodies in the street and briefing against Prince Harry. Hugely critical of William and Kate and how unwarm they were towards Meghan. It's not just that they're having to deal with the aftermath of the revelations in this book and in the Netflix series, but also, of course, they face the prospect, perhaps, of Meghan publishing her own autobiography. And I think that does worry the royal family because she's told interviews in the past, you know, I don't need to watch what I say, I've not been stopped from saying anything. I think she's saying in code she's never signed a non-disclosure agreement, an NDA, so she's free to speak out. And I think that worries the royal family. Perhaps she would shed more light on the racism claim that was made to Oprah Winfrey regarding this unsavoury comment that was allegedly made about the colour of Archie's skin. Meghan initially claimed it was when she was pregnant, but we subsequently found out in that interview from Harry that this was a vague discussion that took place before they were even married. But no matter, the suggestion has been made that a royal was racist. Who was the royal? Is that something that's going to be a bombshell element of any future Meghan autobiography? Who knows? Harry and Meghan weren't invited to commemorate the first anniversary of the late Queen's death in Balmoral in Scotland because they're so far out from the kind of royal fray, and it doesn't look likely that they're going to be invited to anything anytime soon. In light of everything that Prince Harry has said in Spare, you might have thought, as that book hit the bookshelves, my God, you know, is the monarchy facing an existential crisis because of the intimate revelations that Harry has laid bare before a kind of expectant and greedy public? But at the same time, the monarchy's approval ratings seem pretty high. And I think particularly the King's approval rating has held up, despite these very personal criticisms that have been made about him by his own son. So in that regard, from a PR perspective, you could say the House of Windsor's pulled off a bit of a miracle, because it could have gone terribly, terribly wrong. Ironically, the people whose popularity has suffered the most as a result of Megxit are Harry and Meghan themselves, not the royals. Charles has got a difficult task on his hands, in that he needs to maintain the monarchy's relevance in an increasingly sort of polarised world where social media has taken over and the establishment doesn't necessarily form all of the opinions. There has been criticism of the royal family, not just from members of the public or so-called royal subjects, but royals themselves in Harry and Meghan. And so navigating that, I think, has been tricky. But as captain of the ship, I think, to be fair, the King has managed to steer the good ship Royal through pretty choppy waters and is, I think, sailing into calmer seas.